I'm going to leave the path. Airplane mode. Good.
Remind us to put it back on afterwards. We always forget.
No, you're on your own. I just gave you a free night. Nobody's going to bother you. Okay, that's it. Okay, please, silence the phones. Please. No, because we're not going to see the power.
Except when you're registered.
Okay. Okay, what? No, I'm just saying. Okay, folks. I just heard a phone ring. Exactly what we're avoiding. Okay, so please. Turn your phone off, turn it to vibrate, turn it to silence, turn it to airplane mode. Whatever will get it to not ring during this, or text everybody and say don't call me. Okay, it's a real, first of all I want to thank everybody for coming out. It's a real honor and privilege for me to be introducing, you probably the newest colleague right down here? I think so. The newest colleague in South Florida, Rabbi Blumenthal, who came to South Florida to join the Boca Raton Synagogue rabbinic staff. He is the main rabbi at Boca Raton Synagogue West. In addition to that, he teaches at the Katz High School, Katz Yeshiva High School in Boca Raton. Rabbi Blumenthal has a very special quality over just about every rabbi that he knows, and that I know rather, in that he knows how to use technology. So the lights are partially dim here, so that you can see, aside from this beautiful punim, everything that's on the next few pages of the PowerPoint he's going to be using, on the book which you have in your hands. I thank Rabbi Blumenthal. I know he's going to lead off this series with a bang, and we're looking forward to not just this series, but the entire series about learning about the Talmud, being one which will be insightful for us all, and one which will give us a new appreciation of the book, which is really Chayenu Baruch what is our life, and what makes us dedicated to Judaism and to the system that we have dedicated ourselves to, which we promulgate in this shul. We thank Rabbi Blumenthal for being the lead off man.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Billet. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. Looking forward, please God, to a good 2 or 3 hours of joking. A good time learning. We have a lot to cover if we are to understand how the Talmud is the basis of our halachic system. In particular, we're going to be focusing on the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli, although we will differentiate and explain what the Talmud Bavli is and the Talmud Yerushalmi. And if you have any questions at any point in time, please feel free to raise your hands. We'll be using both the PowerPoint and the sources in front of you. But the first thing that we should do is focus on what exactly the Talmud means for us. And this evening's lecture is going to be divided into roughly 3 parts. The first part is going to be understanding what the significance of the Talmud is. The second and much larger chunk of this evening is going to be understanding the 5 centuries of Jewish history in which the Talmud came to be. And then finally, we will wrap up with a little bit of how that development, the development of the Talmud, influences our lives ad hayom hazeh. The first thing to note is the Rambam in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah. You will see this on page 2. Says the Rambam as follows. This is part of his long introduction to the Torah Shebaal Peh, and specifically the book that he is writing, which we'll come back to at the end. He says as follows. Take a look at the underlined part, or just before that. Lamed Daled, paragraph number 34, says the Rambam, Aval kol hadvarim shebetalmud habavli, all of the things that are mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud, chayavin kol beis Yisrael alechas bahem. Every Jew in the whole world, wherever they might be, is bound to and obligated in the observance of everything in the Babylonian Talmud. V'chayvin kol ir ve'ir v'chol medina medina linhog b'chol ha-minhagos. And we perforce, every city, and every state to observe all of the customs that the rabbis of the Talmud observed. And to observe those rabbinic restrictions, as well as to uphold the various rabbinic statutes, both the negative aspects and the positive aspects. The Chachamim throughout the Gemara told us certain things that we cannot do, and many things that we must do. Says the Rambam, pretty authoritative, everything that the Talmud says, we listen to. And as we will see, we will differentiate between the Talmud and that which came before it and that which came after it. But if you take a look at that final paragraph, number 35, Lamed Hey, the Rambam is asking the question and answering the question, why is it that the Talmud is so significant? And this is, of course, the end of the period of the Talmud. We'll give you a sneak peek, a little bit of a spoiler alert. Says the Rambam, the last paragraph on that page, since everything in the Talmud was accepted by all Jews everywhere, the same is true that all of those sages are the sages of the Jewish people. That which they established was upheld and accepted by the entirety of the Jewish people. And those sages of the Talmud that instituted what they instituted and set up what they set up and developed what they developed, they are those, that last line, Sheshamu HaKabbalah B'Ikarei HaTorah Kula, they heard and received the transmission of the Torah, Ish Mipim Ish, one person from another, Ad Moshe Rabbeinu, all the way up until Moses. To recap, says the Rambam, the Talmud is the embodiment of the tradition of the Jewish people that goes from Moses until the end of the Talmudic period. The reason that it is authoritative, says the Rambam, is because it was accepted by all Jews at that time. This has a din, this has a halacha, this has the legal ramifications of a Sanhedrin Haggadah, of the official Jewish judicial system, the Jewish court of law, the Jewish Supreme Court. The last time it was convened, either actually or metaphorically, was the end of the Talmudic era, in which every single Jew in the world accepted the authority of the Talmud. If you take a look at source number 2, we won't read too much of it inside. Source number 2, the Rif, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Al-Fasi, 11th century in Fez, Morocco, writes the authority of the Babylonian Talmud is greater than the authority of the Yerushalmi Talmud, the Israeli Talmud. He writes because the Babylonian Talmud was completed about 100 years after the Talmud Yerushalmi, and as such, the rabbis of the Talmud Bavli were well aware of everything that was written in the Talmud Yerushalmi and took into account all of their positions, thus rendering the Babylonian Talmud as not just authoritative for its own place, but for Jews all over the world, inasmuch as it contains and already pre-understood all of the positions of the Talmud Yerushalmi. Now I should point out that PhD theses have been written on this claim of the Rif, that the sages in Babylon knew everything that was written and that was spoken about in Israel. Many of the things definitely true, although much ink has been spilt on whether or not they knew everything that was in the Talmud Yerushalmi. Nevertheless, says the Rif, the Talmud Bavli contains everything. Everything that we need to know, everything that was discussed up until that period of time. The Russian source number 3, and we're again not going to read too much of it inside, but take a look at that first underlining. Says the Rosh, Yiftach B'dara Kishmul B'dara, invoking the famous Ma'amar of Chazal, the famous statement of the sages, that each person in their generation has the authority to decide halakha. Says the Rosh, with a massive qualifier. Each person in their generation is allowed to make a decision on halakha as long as what they say is in line with the Talmud. One cannot dispute or disagree with the Talmud. In fact, he continues to say that we, Paskin halakha, we develop our system of legal understanding of Judaism not just from the Talmud, but from the latest people in the Talmud. The final generation of Talmud scholars, for a similar reason to the Rif before, because they took into account everything that was said before them, and whatever the Talmud itself declares as the law is binding upon Jews everywhere and always. How to interpret that, how to understand that, he writes, is left up to the experts of each generation. More so, he argues with those that say that one cannot argue with the Gaonim, the generations that came after the Talmud, stating that the generations that came after the Talmud are not nearly as authoritative as the Talmud itself, and as long as one makes sense with the majority opinion of the Talmud, and one is what he refers to as a bar achi, qualified to do so, each qualified person is allowed to make their own conclusions based on the Talmud. How did this all come to be? This document, this massive 2,711 folio work that we refer to as the Talmud Bavli, which thank God has experienced a resurgence in popularity, every year getting more and more popular through the study of the Daf Yomi. Every 7.5-year cycle, more and more Jews around the world are learning the Daf. How did it come to be? What is the makeup? What is the architecture of this work? And in order to understand that, we're going to need to know a little bit about the history of Torah itself. So as we all know, Moses came down from the mountain, 1312 BCE, it's a long time ago. He came down the mountain with luchos, with tablets, 10 commandments, 5 on each one. He came down the mountain with the luchos, but what else did he come down with? Any ideas, suggestions, comments, recipes, thoughts? What else did Moshe come down the mountain with? Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbat. Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbat. Now, obviously, not all of Torah Shabbat. Some of the events of the written Torah were not yet revealed to Moshe. He didn't know them. They hadn't happened yet. For example, hitting the rock and not going to the land of Israel, Moshe was not told on Sinai. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have done it, right? But all of the mitzvahs, at least according to one school of Rishonim, all of the mitzvahs were told to Moshe on Har Sinai, along with all of the Torah Shabbat that accompanied it, right? So Moshe came down from the mountain and said to the Jewish people, "Hey guys, amazing, amazing mitzvah." And they're like, "What do you got for us?" And he said, "Well," and he quoted a pasuk. And the pasuk says, which means, and you will write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And they said to him, "That's amazing. What are we going to write?" It was like, "Well, you should probably write the words of the Shema. That's what Hashem told me." And then we're like, "Oh, that's great." So we just take a Sharpie and write it like on the doorpost, start from the bottom right-hand corner, make our way over the top, write it down the other side. And he was like, no, you have to write it on a scroll. Scroll? Can we write it in purple glitter pen? It was like, no, it's got to be black. And they said, "Can we use cursive or print?" And he said, no, it's got to be like this and not like that. And they were like, "Oh, well, thank you, Moshe Rabbeinu / Rabbi Moshe. That's great." And then he said to them, "You know what? Another mitzvah for you guys. La tevashel gedi v'chalev imo. Do not cook your kid in its mother's milk. And they said to him, so cheeseburgers are okay as long as they come from a cow, right? And he was like, no. It means all meat, not just goat meat. And then they said to him, well, what if it's not a mother and a child? That's okay, right? He's like, no, it includes that as well. And then they said to him, but once we've cooked it, we could, like if somebody else cooked it, we could eat it, right? He's like, no, you can't eat it and you can't cook it. They're like, but if we did, we could sell it to somebody, right? It's like, no, you also can't benefit from it. None of that is in the Torah, Shebichtav. None of it. That is all what we refer to as Torah Shebal Peh. Oral Torah. Gentlemen, what color are your tefillin? Black. Somebody say pink? Why? Black. What shape are they?
Boxes.
Squares, boxes, right? How do you know that? Why? Torah Shebal Peh. Torah Shebal Peh. And this was passed down from Moshe to Yeshua, the first mission in Pirkei Avos tells us. From Moshe to Yeshua, from Yeshua to the Zakanim, from the Zakanim to the Nevi'im. The Nevi'im passed it on to the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, the men of the Great Assembly. And from there, our oral tradition continued. The oral Torah and the written Torah are inextricably linked. You cannot separate one from the other. One cannot extricate the oral Torah from the written Torah. For without it, as the Sefer HaChinuch, and this is on page 4, explains, it will make no sense. He goes on to explain this is not the underlined section, this is the continuation of it. We'll come back to that underlined section perhaps a little later. He quotes many mitzvahs that don't make any sense if you don't have an oral Torah. In fact, those streams of misguided Judaism that rejected the oral Torah at the time of the Second Temple, nevertheless had to make up their own interpretations. It's a misnomer to assume that without the oral Torah one has a book that makes tons of sense and you just need to follow it, and came along these rabbis and added crazy things to it. Not true. God forbid. It's impossible to understand the written Torah without a firm grasp of the oral Torah, because everything requires some level of interpretation. Ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye. Does that not need interpretation? Of course it does. The Maran Tzchias writes that there was never a time in all of Jewish history that anybody had a question about it. When the Talmud wants to know, how does the Torah know it? They're only looking for a source, only looking for a proof. That ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye, is not literal but monetary. These things were passed on Moshe to Yeshua throughout all of the generations. On the screen you will see the shortest history of Tanakh probably ever presented. You have the book of Bereshis, which spans from the creation of the world until the death of Yaakov in Mitzrayim, more or less, or the death of Yosef, really. Sefer Shmos, which introduces Moshe Rabbeinu and tells us about Matan Torah, which happened in 1313 or 1312, according to Wikipedia. Sefer Vayikra spends absolutely no time at all. Bamidbar is 40 years, Varan is 40 days, and in 1272 BCE, the Jewish people enter into the land of Israel. Once they are in the land of Israel, the books of Yehoshua and Shoftim occur, and most of Sefer Shmuel, Aleph, and Beis. By 957 BC, the first Beis Hamikdash is built by Shlomo HaMelech. It is destroyed 410 years later by the Babylonians, resulting in the Babylonian exile. During the period of time of the Babylonian exile, 70 years in Babylonian exile, the story of Purim takes place. In 538 BC, after having returned to Israel a few years earlier, the second Beis Hamikdash is built by Ezra and Nehemiah, and in 70 CE is the Roman exile. That is all of Tanakh in a nutshell, pretty much wrapping it up. Throughout this entire period of time, over 1,300 years, there is only one book that the Jewish people have, and that book is Tanakh. Throughout these centuries, Tanakh expands. First is Chumash, then comes Yehoshua, then Shoftim. After Shoftim, Shmuel, after Shmuel, Malachim. During the period of time of Malachim is when we have the books of the Nevi'im Achronim. Yechezkel, Yirmiyahu, Yeshayahu, many of the Trei Asar, 12 minor prophets. All of them occurring in the period of time of the first temple. Once the first temple is destroyed, the Jewish people go into exile. The books, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, small books at the end of Nevi'im are written. Esther is written. Ezra and Nehemiah are written. And the Tanakh is then canonized. Those that are learning Daf Yomi will know that the canonization of the authorship of it is discussed at the beginning of Baba Basha. That's the Dafim that are being learned in Daf Yomi at the moment. Throughout this time, there is only one book, and that's Tanakh. What about all the Torah Sheba'al Peh? What happened to all of the Torah Sheba'al Peh? So that's being taught, teacher to student, in schools all across the land of Israel, and later in Babylon, teacher to student. Each teacher would have their own curriculum, students would study at their own pace. The Gemara describes how there were in fact two kinds of schools, although this would be a topic for another time. There were schools that studied Torah, and there were schools that studied Nevuah, prophecy. It was like graduate school. Once you had finished knowing all of the Torah Shebichsav and all of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, so if you had wealthy parents, you could go to prophecy school, right? You could go become one of the B'nai Hanavim, the students of the prophets. The Talmud Masechtas Megillah tells us that there were many, many, many prophets that the Jewish people had. Kiflayim kiyotze Mitzrayim, double the amount of people that came out of Egypt. That means more or less 1.2 million prophets. It's a lot of prophets. We only know about 48 male prophets and 7 prophetesses. But there were many, many prophets. They went to prophecy school after learning all of the Torah. And they would be trained in these things. And they would have their own students whom they would teach. Every person with their own school teaching this process. What would happen if a question arose? So a question comes up, right? Some new technology is invented, a new kind of pot, or a new method of smelting metal, or a dialysis machine in ancient times. And somebody wants to know, is it okay to use this on Shabbos, or maybe yes, maybe no? And different rabbis are disputing it. One rabbi says yes, and another rabbi says no. And they're disputing it, and they want to know, what's a mutar, asur, can you do it, can't you do it? So what do? Go to the Supreme Court. Right? The Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin would sit down and they would discuss it. They would arbitrate. And they would come up with a conclusion. They would say yes or no, or wherever it might be. They would make a decision. And that would then be disseminated all across the land, and everybody would know that the halacha in this situation is asr or mutar, permissible or forbidden, tamei, tahar, pure, impure, chayiv, potter, obligated, you're exempt. All of these things would be discussed by the Supreme Court, by the Sanhedrin. And then comes Herod. Before we understand anything about the Talmud, we need to understand the climate of the land of Israel, pre-first century. Herod begins his rule in 37 BC. He's the second son of Antipater. Talmud describes how he heard a voice ringing out from heaven saying, anybody that rebels against his masters will be successful today. And he rebelled against his masters, who were none other than the Hashmonaim, the ruling dynasty of the Second Temple for about the last 200 years of the Temple era. So the Second Temple is built, the Greeks invaded, the story of Hanukkah occurs, and the Hashmonaim are now the kings. Torah study is pretty commonplace. There is a Sanhedrin that is operational. They're deciding the law. And then Herod comes along and he hears that voice from heaven that if I rebel today, I'll be successful. Herod goes and kills all of the Hashmonaim, leaving one daughter of the Hashmonaim for himself to marry. She shortly afterwards jumps from a roof committing suicide, saying that she wanted no part in that. He's infamously cruel. He executes the members of the Sanhedrin except for one student of Shammai, the famous Shammai, a student by the name of Baba bin Buta. He dies in 4 BC after destroying the Sanhedrin, killing all the rabbis, driving terror underground. Nevertheless, he is an ally of Rome, who is the ruling power at the time, and thus very prosperous. 3 major things that Herod achieved, aside from his cruelty or as a result of it. The first is that he drove the Sanhedrin underground. The second was that he separated religion and politics. This is the first separation of church and state. Now, in an American context, this preserves the rights and freedoms of various religions to practice freely within the United States. In Israel at the time, this was a disaster. You used to have a state that was governed by Torah law. And all of a sudden, Herod says, I don't need this Torah, I don't need these rabbis, I don't need anybody telling me anything. Herod, of course, was an illegitimate king. He was a slave. He was not allowed, al-pi halacha, according to the Torah law, to be a king, yet he crowned himself and called himself as such. He separated religion and politics. He ruled with fear. Nevertheless, he stabilized Judea, the areas of Judea, and thus Rome liked him. And thus we come to the 1st century. Herod dies. Those of you that have traveled recently to the old city of Yerushalayim, so you'll see if you go on the Kotel Tunnel tours, that there is the wall of the Kotel extends all the way north, and there's an unfinished stone towards the end of it. So apparently that was the stone that was being worked on when Herod died. Herod was the official renovator of the Beis HaMikdash. And the Talmud describes the story of how he was convinced to do this by Baba bin Buta, the last of the Chachamim, the one that he didn't kill. I suppose that story will be for another time. But Herod was a tyrant. Totally changed the way that Torah works, totally changed the way that Israel was governed, because as opposed to being able to bring matters forward to a court, so that court was driven underground, people couldn't communicate, people couldn't learn the way that they used to. When Herod dies, he's succeeded by his son, Herod Archelaus, who was cruel and tyrannical, but he thought himself to be as great as his father. He was not, and he's deposed by the Romans 10 years into his rule. Being fired, of course, by the Romans means not just losing your job. Torah leadership at the time. Let's understand what the makeup of the land of Israel is. The 1st century, the Romans recorded over 8 million Jews, 2.5 million of them living in Israel. So already at this point in time, there's a large Jewish diaspora. Where is the largest center of Jews outside of Israel at the time? Babylon, right? Remember, because they were exiled there 400 or so years earlier. Not everybody came back with Ezra, in fact only a small percentage. So there's a large community in Babel, there are many Jews everywhere else. Babylonia is the center of Torah study. This is highlighted by the rise of Hillel HaZakir, right? The famous Hillel. Hillel and Shammai. Shammai was Israeli. Hillel was Babylonian. He only had been to Israel once before, when at the age of 80 he arrived in Yerushalayim. There was a major question to be asked regarding the Korban Pesach. Nobody could answer the question. Hillel gave an answer, and on the spot they elected him to be the Nasi, to be the head of the Jewish community, head of the Jewish academy. Hillel and Shammai had separate schools, and as Herod's rule and tyranny continues, questions that were previously resolved now become contentious. Now, we'll skip that in the interest of time. There is a timeline of the destruction of the Second Temple. As we get into the middle of the 1st century, zealots are revolting against Roman rule, and Vespasian brings 4 legions from Rome to conquer the Jewish community. 67 CE, Gamla falls. 68 CE, Yerushalayim is surrounded. The Talmud Insights describes the story of the destruction of the Second Temple. Different factions of Jews fighting against each other. Infighting ensues, and as a result, storehouses that the Talmud describes could have sustained the Jewish community for 21 years were burnt or destroyed, forcing the Jewish community into one of two options. Either submit to the Romans or be killed. 69 CE, Yerushalayim is besieged, and in 70 CE, the temple is destroyed. Accounts of the time, including Josephus, record that 1 million Jews are killed in the destruction of the Second Temple and the massacre surrounding it. But from the ashes of the Second Temple, something interesting occurs. The Talmud in the Masechtas Gittin describes to us how just before, the year before, the temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is smuggled out of Yerushalayim. He's smuggled out in a coffin as if he had died. He meets Vespasian, greets him as Caesar. The Talmud describes how Vespasian says to him, if I am Caesar, you should be executed for not coming to me earlier. But since I'm not Caesar, you should be executed for treason, for referring to a general as Caesar. As this conversation is taking place, a messenger arrives from Rome and says, Vespasian, Caesar has died. You are the new Caesar. Hail Caesar. Vespasian, duly impressed with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and somehow his divine understanding of the world, tells him, what do you want from me? He asks for three things. The first is, he says, Ten li Yavne v'chachameha, give me Yavne and its sages. Meaning, allow the academy of Yavne to survive. Second, the family of the Nasi, the family of Hillel, the family that goes back to David HaMelech, needs to survive this. Let that family survive. Let them be smuggled out. Let them survive. And finally, Rabbi Tarfon, who was one of the Gedolei Hadar, one of the greatest sages of that generation, was exceptionally ill as a result of his repeated fasts, asking repentance to the Jewish community. Doctors for Rabbi Tarfon, these three wishes are granted. The Talmud is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, and the era of Talmud begins. After the Churban, Khan returns to Judea. Not a lot going on. Thousands of Jewish prisoners are freed from Rome, prisoners that were taken before. The Gemaras tell us about questions of leadership and succession, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Yeshua. But that period of calm, that brief period of calm, lasts less than 15 years. By 86 CE, Emperor Domitian orders that the Sanhedrin is disbanded, and then there's a short respite for 2 years at 96 CE, when Nerva restores certain liberties to the Jewish people. Nerva took over as emperor from Domitian. And this takes us to the 2nd century. Trajan succeeds Nerva in 98 CE. Little nugget of historical knowledge, there was a coin that Nerva had minted in those 2 years that reads, Fisci Judaiki Calumnia Sublata. Those of you that know Latin will know that that means the abolition of malicious prosecution in connection with Jewish tax. He celebrated the fact that Jews were no longer going to be persecuted. He didn't last very long. And Trajan felt the need to revoke any liberties given to the Jewish community. Now, something important and interesting about Trajan is that he wanted to be very successful in his battles and wanted to conquer all the nations to the east, in particular the Parthians, which included Bavel. Bavel is important because lots of Jews are there. The Jews supported the Babylonians in that war. And though at the beginning of the war in 114 CE, Trajan seems to be winning, by 116 he is defeated and blames the Jews. This is not an uncommon theme that we will see throughout Jewish history. People lose wars, blame the Jews. This leads Trajan to begin his aggressions against Jewish communities all throughout the Roman Empire. Massacring Jews, the great community in Alexandria is destroyed. And Trajan appoints somebody by the name of Lucius specifically to oppress the Jews in Israel. But in 117, Trajan dies, and if we thought it was going to get better, it got worse, because Hadrian becomes the next emperor. Hadrian bans Bris Milah, Talmud Torah, Shabbos, Mikvah. He wants to make Jerusalem into a Roman city called Aelia Capitolina, and this is, of course, when the Great Revolt of Bar Kokhba begins. Very briefly, Bar Kokhba wins Yerushalayim, Hebron, and areas of Judea, rules it for about 2.5 years, enough time to mint coins of a Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. But when Bar Kokhba's revolt fails, this is the last time we see Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel until 1948. That's a long, long time. Close to 2,000 years. Hadrian dies in 139 CE, succeeded by his son. And then in 161, something very important and interesting occurs. A man by the name of Marcus Aurelius, full name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, becomes emperor in Rome. And this is one of the most important events in all of Jewish history. Because up until this point in time, the Jewish community for about 200 years was under intense Roman persecution. There are many stories that we have of this period of time, stories that we know well, stories that we cry over. The stories of the Asara Harugei Malchus, the 10 martyrs killed by Rome. Stories of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai hiding in a cave. The stories of Lag BaOmer, of fleeing persecution. Rabbi Akiva, whose body was flayed by Roman combs, while he said Shema Yisrael as he sold the parts. Jewish communities in the land of Israel are under such intense and immense persecution that there is a question of whether or not study of Torah Shebaal Peh will continue. And this is the most important point of this period of time. Because when one understands that for close to 1,500 years, all of the Torah Shebaal Peh, how to write a mezuzah, how to wear tefillin, how to keep Shabbos, how to keep Pesach, how to build a sukkah, what's a lulav and esrog, what's muktzah. All of these halachas are passed on generation after generation, rabbi to student to rabbi to student, 1,500 years. All of that is now in jeopardy. All of it. Because if one cannot complete one's education, students are being cut down. And one cannot acquire sufficient education because teachers are being strung up and executed. So is there enough of a critical mass of Jews that understand, that know Torah, that have a grasp of the Torah Shebaal Peh, such that it can continue? And the answer, unfortunately, devastatingly, tends to a no. And thus a man by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, scion of the house of the Nasi, of Hillel and David HaMelech, becomes the leader of the Jewish community in the land of Israel, specifically northern Israel. And he begins to collect manuscripts of all of the schools of the rabbis of the time. And he collects a little bit from Rabbi Meir's yeshiva. And he collects a little bit from Rabbi Yosef's yeshiva. And he collects a little bit from Rabbi Gamliel's yeshiva. And he collects a little bit from Rabbi Akiva's yeshiva. And Rabbi Tarfon's yeshiva. And all of those yeshivas, throughout the last 200 years before him, collects them and begins to edit them. And as he begins to edit them, he begins to form a curriculum. would be contained within all of these opinions of the various schools, remembering, of course, that conclusive decisions had not been reached for 2 centuries because there was not a Sanhedrin to arbitrate. So he collects all of these opinions and he starts to edit them. And he forms an unlikely and beautiful friendship with Marcus Aurelius, Antoninus. So much so that Chazal explained that the relationship between Rabbi Akiva and Antoninus and Marcus Aurelius is paradigmatic of the relationship that should have been had between Yaakov and Esau. The might and the majesty of rule with the beauty of Torah. And there are 20 years that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is allowed to work almost undisturbed by persecution, undisturbed by pogroms and massacres and libels, in which he puts together the second Jewish book ever written, and the basis of our Talmud, of course. We're talking about the Mishnah. And this he compiles from all of the different schools. He compiles it into 6 orders, 60 tractates, 60 masechtas, all in all. And he writes it down as a curriculum. If you take a look on page 5, the Talmud Insights tells us Rebbe Reb Nosson Sof Mishnah. At first underlining Rebbe Reb Nosson Sof Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi and Reb Nosson of the end of the Mishnah period. Rashi explains Ad Yemehem. Sorry, I put the arrow in the next one, so if you go one Rashi up, for those that would like to follow. Sof Tanaim Ad Yemehem Omru Ishas Dvar B'Beis HaMedrash. Up until that time, up until Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, a teacher would walk into the Beis Medrash and teach whatever he wanted to teach. Vayu Talmidim Dorsim Shmua Shmua Levada, and each student would learn each lesson from each teacher. V'lo Yehayu Masechtas Seduros. There was no curriculum, there were no tractates. V'seder, and there was no order. Sorry, but V'seder Rekibetz ala Seder, and then Rabbi came and he ordered and organized everything according to an order. V'heim kalalu ha'amur b'darish livneihem, and they collected all of the things that were said before. V'sidrus ha'masechtas, and they arranged and organized the tractates. V'achreihem lo yositu ela ma'at, and after the conclusion of the Mishnah, very little was added, said Rashi. This was the work of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. And he writes it down into the Shisha Sidri Mishnah, incorporating all of Jewish law. Everything. Everything that the halacha has to offer. All of this is included in one set of books, the 6 books of the Mishnah. Now he completes this work in 188 CE, which is pretty much 1500 years after Sinai. For 1500 years, the oral Torah was not written down. Until Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi realized the precariousness and the danger of the times that he was in, the unique opportunity during the respite that was Marcus Aurelius' rule, to do something that is arguably the most significant event since Matan Torah, the writing down of the Torah Shebaal Peh. Rebbe dies roughly in the year 200 CE. Historians debate whether or not he saw the publishing of the Mishnah. It was published by Rav 30 years later. Either way, the end of the period of the Amoraim, of the Tanaim, rabbis of the Mishnah, ends by the beginning of the 3rd century. And the period of Amoraim begins. Now, what we'll see in the 3rd and 4th century is that Israel slowly begins to decline. Rebbe was correct in his understanding that were it to be that Torah would only be taught orally, it would more than likely be lost. We see that Rebbe is succeeded by his son, Rabbi Gamliel. who was succeeded by his son, Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, which is the Aramaic of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, said in Aramaic in order to differentiate. But Rabbi Yochanan assumes the spiritual inheritance of Rebbe and becomes the first and greatest of the Amora'i Eretz Yisrael, the rabbis of the Gemara of the land of Israel. Now, if all of the halachas of Torah Sheba'al Peh were written down in the Mishnah, why do you need anybody to talk about it? Well, Rebbe wrote down in a concise and sometimes cryptic way. Rebbe tried to preserve a sense of brevity and a need for oral discussion. And thus, while Rebbe encodes in the Mishnah, while Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, encodes in the Mishnah everything that you need to know for the sake of knowing halacha, it's not all visible on the surface. And many, many discussions will ensue. Stability is eventually achieved in northern Israel, but Torah leadership is firmly decentralized. And we see this in the next century. More or less, leadership of the Jewish community shifts completely from Israel to Babel. Now, Rebbe himself believed that the center of Torah should always be in Eretz Yisrael. But his student Reb Chia disagreed. Reb Chia argued that Babel was a more hospitable and a better environment for Jews to flourish, and what's important to understand, and we'll notice this as a theme throughout Jewish history, is that in Babel poverty was common but outside influences were limited. This, ironically enough, is the ideal situation for Torah leadership to thrive. When Jews don't live well but are undisturbed. You can think back to what we know about European Jewish history. The great eras of Torah study of the Rishonim and the Achronim. How there was poverty, but relatively left alone. And thus for 3 centuries, Torah more or less thrives undeterred in Babel. Great students of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rav. He's a nephew of Rabbi Chia, an Israeli by birth. At the age of 60, he moves to Babylon and takes a job, finally becoming the Rosh Yeshiva of a yeshiva called Surah. His contemporary and interlocutor Shmuel is the Rosh Yeshiva of Nehar Da'ah. He's a physician, an astronomer, and a mathematician. And the Talmud tells us that in Isu V'Heter, in matters of religious law, we follow the opinion of Rav. But when it comes to legal monetary matters, we follow the opinion of Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel argue thousands of times throughout the 2,711 pages of the Talmud. And this is the first generation of Jewish scholarship in Babel. The 4th generation, Rabbi Yochanan, has died. He's succeeded by Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi. By 305 CE, Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya II was the great-grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. He's the last Nasi, the last leader of the Israeli Jewish community to even be mentioned as an honorable mention in the Babylonian Talmud. The last major act, the 2 last major acts, rather, of the Jewish community in Israel before it pretty much dims into complete irrelevance is the institution of the Jewish calendar, and that's by Hillel II in 359. The last thing that he does is establish the Jewish calendar, and that we observe up until this very day. And the Talmud Yerushalmi is written. And we'll note that the Talmud Yerushalmi, as we mentioned earlier, was written more or less 100 years before the Talmud Bavli. Stylistically, it's considerably less edited. It's a little more difficult to read, and it covers less material. And this, I suppose, would account for the 100-year difference between them. In Babel, however, as opposed to in Israel, in Eretz Yisrael, where Torah scholarship is waning, Rav Chia and Rav Huna and Surah. In 326, Abaya, the famous Pumbedisa. Rava is the Rosh Hashiva in Mechosa. And their arguments are mentioned over 2,000 times in the Talmud. Thereafter, there is Rava and Rabbi Yosef in Pumbedisa. And after Abai and Rava, Rav Papa becomes the Rosh Hashiva. These are all famous names that we know throughout the Talmud. How did this book of the Talmud end up being composed? So in the middle of the late 300s, really, 371 until 427, a man by the name of Rav Ashi is raised to a Rosh Hashiva. He's 19 years old at the time. And he is the primary editor of the Babylonian Talmud. And I want to read to you in source number 6, on page 6, how it was that Rav Ashi compiled the Babylonian Talmud. And this is not in Hebrew, this is in Aramaic. And the text that we are reading is from Rav Shreya Gaon. Rav Shreya Gaon died in the 11th century. And he wrote a very famous work called the Igeres Rabbeinu Shreya Gaon, the letter, which is more like a book, in which he describes the entire history of the Jewish community of Babylon from the Talmudic era until his own, about 500 years. He says as follows: V'noam Rav Ashi Rashivasa v'Mesivase. Rav Ashi became the Rosh Hashiva. And he ruled Korev L'Shishin Shnim, close to 60 years, from the age of 19. V'hainu de'amrinon be'perek mishames. And this is what is referred to in Maseches Bava Basra, the perek mishames, which is source 7, although it says 6 there. That's below on the page. B'ma'adura kamen Rav Ashi amar lam hachi. The first version of Rav Ashi, he said this. In the second verse of Rav Ashi, he said something different. What does this mean? He says, such was Rav Ashi's decree. He says Rav Ashi would gather together all of the Talmid Chachamim in Bava. All of the Talmid Chachamim, thousands of rabbis and students, twice a year, for a month at a time. What's known today as the Yarchei Kal, 2 months of learning. And in each Yarchei Kal, they would learn a Masechta. They would learn one tractate. How many tractates are there in the Talmud? 60. 60 tractates. So if you learn 2 tractates a year, how many years does it take? 30 years. How long did Rav Ashi rule for?
56.
60 years. Rav Ashi was Rosh Hashiva for 60 years. Says Rav Shreya Gaon, what Rav Ashi did was the following. You understand the power and prowess, the forward thinking and the genius of Rav Ashi. He gathered together thousands of Rabbanim and Talmidei Chachamim. And he said, this year we're learning brachos. And everybody got all of their notes from all of the issues. And they collected everything. And they disputed and debated. They started with the Mishnah. And they spoke about everything that had been discussed in the previous 5 generations. Rav and Shmuel, and Abai and Rav and Rav Papa, and Rav Chisda and Rav Sheshes. And they got together all of the major opinions of everyone. And then compiled it all into one document. And then they gave it to other students to edit and think about and argue and hone every single word. Thousands of people working on this document. Thousands of people. Until finally, at the end of the month, they had finished one Masechta. And they would announce, in 6 months' time when you come back, they would do this in Elul and in other. 6 months' time when you come back, we are learning why we just learned brachos, so we'll do Shabbos. Next time we're doing Shabbos. Of course, they went through all the Masechtas. Took 30 years to get through Shas. and 60 years to get through Shas twice. So Rosh Hashanah says this is what the Talmud is referring to when the students would say, the first time we learned this with Rav Ashi, he said this, and the second time we learned it with Rav Ashi, he said that. 30 years had gone by and he had time to think about it and edit it. So by the second time, they really got everything right. They made sure that they had everything 100% exact. The work of Rav Ashi and Ravina, who was the publisher later, contains the works of all of the Amoraim, all of the primary opinions of Bavel, as well as many opinions of Israel as well, Yochanan and Rish Lakish, their students. There are 2,200 Amoraim mentioned by name in the Talmud, and that's only a small fraction of the students and teachers that existed at the time. Ravinu II, as a student of Rav Ashi, publishes the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, in 475. As a collective and a collaborative effort, as a document that contained every single detail of every single dispute and argument and opinion and thought and theory, an idea and dissent, an agreement of all of the generations previously. And thus the words of the Rambam that we began with ring very true. Everyone accepted this document. Everyone accepted it. Now, if you take a look at the following page, you'll see this timeline of the land of Israel. It's a pretty decent timeline of the history of Halakha. Ancient Israel we spoke about. Ancient Israel, there is only Torah she'nichtav. Babylonia, still Torah she'nichtav. Persian Empire, construction of the Second Temple, still Torah she'nichtav. The Hellenistic era, the Hasmonean dynasty, all of this is all simply Torah she'nichtav. By the Roman era, by around 200, the Mishnah is compiled of all of the works of the Tanaim. And by 475, the middle of the Byzantine era in the land of Israel, the Babylonian Talmud is completed in Bavel and is disseminated throughout the world. Now there's a long way away between us and the Babylonian Talmud. But after the death of Rav Ashi, Yazdegerd II, who was the ruler of Persia at the time, is succeeded by a man by the name of Paros, who, as opposed to Yazdegerd, who was exceedingly favorable to Jews, is not. There's a famine in 464, 470, rabbis are captured and executed. And as the Talmud is being published, shuls are closed, Jewish children are kidnapped, and Zoroastrianism takes hold in Bavel. And 300 years of relative quiet in Bavel begins to decline, begins to come to an end. And Jews begin to ship out all over the world. The major seat of learning is still Babylon. And there will be 500 years of Gaonim, most of whom we know their names. We don't know a tremendous more about them. But the works of the Talmud are being studied. Halachic rulings are being issued. People are learning and trying to understand how to live a normal, healthy and Jewish life no matter where they end up going. There's a part two to this, perhaps for another time, which is how we got from the Talmud to the Shulchan Aruch, which is our code of Jewish law. Suffice it to say, very briefly, that the Talmud, for anybody that's opened it, is a very challenging book to study. It requires, aside from a good knowledge of Aramaic, the ability to read through immense amounts of texts and abstract from there practical ideas of how to live. By the time that the 1100s rolled around, with the 1000s, the 11th century, the Rif, who we mentioned earlier, realizes that people are having a hard time chewing through Talmud and offers a concise, shortened version of it, where he just takes the bottom lines of the Talmud and puts them together. After him, the great Rambam, Rav Moshe ben Maimon, says the Talmud is too difficult for people to understand all by themselves. People don't know how to practice halacha. Instead of them having to look at a Talmud and then look at a Rif, I will create the first code of Jewish law, since the Mishnah, in fact, that people will open up an independent book and be able to learn it all based on the Talmud. I'll just go through the Talmud for you and give you the bottom line. The Rambam, of course, being a Sephardi, at this point in time, the Jewish world had already split. Those that went to Europe became Ashkenazim. Those that went to North Africa, eventually to Spain, Sephardim. The Ashkenazi world said absolutely not. And the works of the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, became a halachic work that would rival the Rambam, with Ashkenazi solutions to problems of the Talmud. By the time the Rosh's son, the Tur, begins to compile his work of halacha, he has the Rif and the Rambam and his father, the Rosh, all of their works to put together. Of course, the works of the Tur then flow into what we know today as the Shulchan Aruch, the 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch, which once again were accepted probably by almost every Jew in the world. The Ramah of Moshe Yisraelis in Krakow at the time writes an Ashkenazi supplement to the Shulchan Aruch, and thus the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah are published side by side in every printing. From the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah comes all of our practical halacha today. There's a very beautiful thing, however, when one studies halacha, is that ultimately one can trace back every single law to the Talmud. And those that have studied Talmud will know that on the sides of the page of the Talmud are hyperlinks. It's the first instance of an internet. You'll see next to words in the Talmud will be links that will take you to the Rambam and to the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch. Links that will take you back to the Psukim, that will tell you where the Talmud got this law from, proving it from verses. And other links in the Talmud that will show you how this discussion applies to other areas of halacha. All of that accessible from one page of Talmud. And thus each and every halacha, each law that we observe today, we can trace back to the Shulchan Aruch, which can trace it back to the Rambam, the Rif, the Rosh, who trace back to the Babylonian Talmud, who trace back to the Mishnah, who trace back to Moshe Rabbeinu. And thus each and every halacha that we observe today is a continuation of a tradition that began 3,000 years ago at Sinai. A tradition of what Hashem wants the world to look like. The center and the focal point of that journey is the Talmud, which we've discussed this evening. Thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful day.